Okay, so working for an airline, I think I should start punctually. Our official definition of on-time arrival or on-time departure and arrival is within 15 minutes, so I'm comfortably within that. So let me introduce myself. My name's Alan Spanos. I work in the Business Intelligence Department in British Airways. Uh, so hello. You can't hear me? Can you hear me now? Oh, okay, great. Sorry. I was a little bit worried you wouldn't be able to see me, so I think that's a benefit. Yeah, my name's Alan Spanos. I work in the Business Intelligence Department in British Airways. It's my colleague Jay Albee is the architect on the Hadoop project for us. And today I'm just going to take you through. My part of it won't be vastly technical. It will touch on technical points of Hadoop, but more in terms of how you make the business case for deploying big data architecture within your company. And I'll talk you through BA as an example and how I did that case. And then Jay will talk to you about our actual implementation and some of the modules within the HTTP platform that we're using to deploy. So if it sounds like the wrong thing that you've turned up to, now's your chance to leave. Otherwise, you're stuck. So, like I say, I'll talk through the business case. Uh, I'll tell you about BA and what we're doing, and then I'll also hand over to Jay to talk about the 2.2 HTTP deployment that we're going to do. Okay, so can I just have a quick show of hands? So, who in the room is a business owner or somebody in business intelligence who may have to run a project and not necessarily implement it themselves technically? Great, you'll find this very useful. Anybody who's a provider of software or services to a client? You'll probably find this very useful as well. Uh, Anyone who is an implementation specialist from IT developer? Hopefully find Jay's a bit more useful than me, but I think contextually this will still be interesting for you. So how did I get into Hadoop and why did I start looking at it? So I'm probably an analyst by trade. I started off as a customer and commercial analyst within British Airways. Then I moved into the CRM team, then did some revenue synergies analytics, and then moved into BI. Why did I do that? I suppose I ended up being one of those people where I started looking at the more and more I wanted to do something, the more and more people had put barriers up in my way, and I thought in BI there's the least barriers that you have, so I moved there. And you get the most tools as well. Um, but when you're running a Hadoop project, I think one of the biggest difficulties is trying not to let the technology lead the project. So as a lot of the keynotes have said and some of the other talks I've gone to, um, you have to think about your actual business driver. So these are the kind of things that I thought of when I was doing my case and tried to think about how do I actually get this through the door. You can come to these events, you can think all this stuff is cool, but if you can't actually get your finance teams and your business leaders and your CFOs and your leadership teams to buy into it, then you will never do anything. You will never deploy this software and you'll never deploy this capability. Now, why did I start doing it from a BI point of view? I suppose the reason I did that was because when I first experienced Hadoop and had a look at it, actually with my partner who works for another company, I quickly realized that I think in BI, if you don't adopt this technology to do at least part of what your job role is or your function within your company is, that you won't exist in a few years' time, to be quite frank. You know, you can only get so far with traditional technology. I still believe, and Jay and I will talk around the fact that traditional technology still has a place within your architecture, even if you do deploy Hadoop. But quite frankly, this is somewhere you need to be. So I do believe what the guy was saying this morning, that 100% of large enterprises will adopt this technology if they haven't done already. So a couple of things that you probably won't hear from suppliers and you probably won't hear from technical people and you probably won't hear from people that own the distributions. So you'll get asked a lot of questions when you go through a business case of, I've heard the technology is very cheap, what about the people to deploy it? That's fantastically expensive. So how do you actually make those numbers add up? People have talked about, you know, the lack of capability in this area, which I think actually is getting better over time as people hear it pays well and things like that. More people move into the area, but that's still something to consider. So whether you choose to work with people that have already deployed clusters in other companies, or whether you choose to work with service providers, that is something you need to include in your business case. Otherwise, you just need to give yourself a healthy amount of time for your internal staff to actually learn how to do that. Secondly, how does it fit into your business strategy? So I think that, a lot of the cases that you'll see focus on value cases, which actually your biggest limiter here is your own company or your own finance department or your own business leaders believing the wild numbers you'll throw at them, and actually believing the fact they can even track the value. What I'll go through, there's several cases you can do, but there's a very simple case that commodity hardware is just cheaper than engineered hardware. So that's a business case in itself, which is one of the options that you have. And I think the HDP platform and Hadoop in general is ideally placed that you don't have to only do one use case. You can roll that out to, in waves, several cases afterwards. Think about your key stakeholders. So who owns the money is quite an important one. So in a large enterprise, you're going to have separate hardware teams, separate application teams, separate analytical teams, separate business areas that you have to work with. So you have to think about who's got skin in the game in terms of making your case, going to get your money, and then actually focusing on delivering value for those guys. Your financial process is very important as well. Like I say, do your finance guys and your budget holders within the company, are they very worried about tangible financial value, or are they willing to take a bit of a kind of leap of faith that you can deliver something just by putting something there? I don't think a lot of you will find that's actually a good way to start. And also think about your user base. So actually, my partner was using DB2 as a transactional database or a typical RDBMS. And using Hadoop for her is actually, try and make it as simple as possible. Why is Hive even there? It's because all the analysts in most of your companies will already know how to write SQL. That is a standard. Why don't you just continue with that? There's no need to change it if it works for those applications. And also, very, very important, think about your current BI landscape. So you're a new startup, maybe you don't have an RDBMS. If you're an existing company of 100 years old, you probably have everything under the sun. So think about the place and the actual business role that Hadoop is going to play in your organization. Very important. And also how it's going to link into your existing architecture. How's it going to link into your existing BI tools, Tableau or enterprise reporting tools or ClickView, any of that stuff that you have, how's it going to fit in? How's it going to connect? How are you going to authenticate? How are you going to make sure that you can give a consistent experience to the users, whether they're connecting to a Hadoop data source or something else? Very important. So I suppose the term that I tried to come up with is to think about what is your anchor case. So just another, I won't do this too much. So is anybody stuck at the proof of concept phase or done a few trials with Hadoop and can't really make it work in terms of actually becoming a kind of operational expenditure rather than a one-off capital? Anybody done that? For you? So I think in terms of having an anchor case, what I like to think of is this is something that's going to provide continual value to your business. So typical examples of that would be things like archiving of cold data off your existing, maybe more expensive engineered systems, sandboxes that you may have on those systems as well. In terms of cost, you can give your users much more space to work with. Constant issue, I can't get enough space for this. Why are you that worried about how much this costs? Well, if you reduce the cost of that, you can give them a lot more value as well. And also things like moving ETL, ELT down to Hadoop, common use case that lots of providers will start to talk to you about. I think in all of this, the most useful phrase I've found when somebody asks me a question of, how are you going to do this with Hadoop? Usually the answer I try to give, and Jay will explain a little bit about this as well, is I'm going to do it how I already do it, because that must be compliant with all my processes. It must be compliant with all my security standards, and it must be compliant with anything else that anybody asks me when I go through this project. So actually the technical complexity of Hadoop, which is, I don't think it's as simple as an engineered system. You have to set it up properly. You have to choose different configurations depending on your use cases, is something that you should focus most of your time on, especially when you implement the platform. there are other benefits that Jay will talk about later, that once you've deployed that platform and dealt with all that complexity, then if you use any of the other modules you didn't have in your original case, that's fine. They will be there. It can be as simple as just clicking a box in Ambari and actually deploying that functionality across your cluster. So like I say, I think starting with a simple case, while it may seem boring and may seem like you can't put a number of 50, 20, 50, 70 million of benefit that can't be tracked in front of a finance manager, it's actually something that's going to help fund paying for the complexity of the actual deployment up front. Okay, so I am just going to give credit to Hortonworks and Ben for this slide. I nicked it off one of their customer use cases. So I think the reason I used it was basically just to kind of demonstrate how you can deal with business cases. So not from a technical point of view, but from an actual business point of view. You cannot underestimate that if you are the owner of deploying this platform, I suppose, like a traditional warehouse or EDW, that as soon as you do the first project, or even before you've done the first project, somebody hears about it and says, wow, that's great, can you do it for me as well? So the scalability of Hadoop is great because you should be able to react to that a bit quicker than you would if you had to then go and negotiate and upgrade your hardware for an engineered system, for example, or think about licensing if you've taken on a new partner or something like that. But I think this shows a little bit around, start simple. Like I say, start on something where you can sink a lot of the cost of deploying the core components of Hadoop, and then you can get to all the cool stuff at the top around things like machine learning and real-time data. I think what I've found as well with the business stakeholders that I work with, of which I'm one, is they find it quite hard to articulate some of the benefits of, okay, I'm going to score something about this flight. There's going to be some inherent value to this flight, or some kind of risk score I'm going to give it to kind of help me allocate business resources to actually fixing something or making more money. How do they actually describe or model the benefit of that to actually get the funds to actually deploy it? Very difficult. One of the things that I'm trying to do is by deploying the cluster that we'll have is basically to say, well, there you go, there's a test environment. Scale it up temporarily, do a trial, prove the value, give it over to your finance person, and then you can do that persistently. You can then run an operational process. And even that operational process after that point may even move into your EDW warehouse. So it doesn't necessarily need to stay on Hadoop to actually do that. So reuse, not reinvent. I think this is absolutely key. So one of the things that I think is really prevalent in a large enterprise relative to small companies, I'm very, very envious when I go and talk to either small providers of services or small startup companies, tech companies, all those guys. How many people do you need to take with you when you go through this journey with Hadoop? 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Okay, try taking 1,000 people with you. Yeah, try taking an analyst community of hundreds of people with you. Try and explain to them, try and do all those training courses where you've got to take them through the changes with what do they do now and what do they do, what did they used to do before. It's actually surprisingly difficult. You have to create all the collateral, you have to go through all that change program that you have to go through any business change for. So what I think about Hadoop is actually you don't need to do that. Not for everything. So, who's going to run data governance of the platform? Well, who runs data governance for your platforms now? Make it the same people. It's just another platform. Who's going to administer the platform? Make it the system administrators that you have now. How are you going to apply for access for it? Make it the same system you apply for access for everything else. Who's going to actually be the users? Well, it's going to be your current statisticians, your data scientists, your data analysts. It's the same people. Who's going to actually develop the job? So there's a better framework, I think, or a different framework with Hadoop than things like SQL, PL SQL, or integration software that you can use at the moment, but it's still going to probably be the same people that you use to actually do that development as well. So why change that? Why complicate your project by deciding you're going to flip up an entirely new team just to deal with this architecture? It doesn't need to be that way if you don't want it to. Okay, and I think one of the things as well just to think of is around who are you? So where do you work in your organization, and what is your priority for Hadoop and the platform that you're choosing? So for me, I work in BI. I own the cost, or my team owns the cost of the data warehouse platform that we have. We also all own all of the front end systems. So what's the most effective business case that I can make, that I can own most of, so that I don't need to go out and influence the entire population in British Airways or in IAG to actually do? Well, I own that cost, so I can do a business case around that cost. That's fine. All I then need to deal with is a fallout in other areas of deploying that. So the good thing, again, I've found with actually making the case and the economics of it, which I'll talk about, is almost everyone I've talked to, I'm lowering the total cost of ownership for them as well. So when they come and talk to you and say, right, your budget is benefiting and your department is benefiting because upfront cost of expanding storage is going down, my department actually doesn't own the ongoing cost of hardware. But then I can go to that department as well and say, well, okay, that's good for you as well. So you get quite easy buy-in and quite quick buy-in for your projects. So that's enough kind of boring principle. But I think the reason that I wanted to show this section is because I wanted to make it a little bit generic for your companies. So if you want to engage with a client as a consultant or as a provider, or if you work in a company yourself, I think you can use some of those principles and actually try to have an easier case to make to go through actually getting the money to do this. Okay, so us as a case study, what do we go for? So you might have guessed by now, but we actually went for a cost-saving project. One of the things that we do quite a lot, and a lot of companies I think will identify with this, is basically we quite often, depending on who wants to sue us at any given time or what business activity we're doing, have to provide data to legal bodies or for legal cases or for things like strategic cases, things like that as well. And we found that what we used to do is we used to archive the data off our EDW platform and then restore it to our EDW platform when we needed to do that work. We ended up having to do that so often that we just left it on our EDW platform, even though we didn't actually use it very often. So the cost of having a highly engineered, high-performance architecture for something that you don't use very often and you don't really need quick turnaround times for was not really worth it. And like I say, in BI, we were owning the budget of actually providing that to the business, or actually we were having to provide that data quite a lot as well. So I actually put a very simple project together, which was, let's move that to Hadoop. Let's save money that way. Let's actually not delete the space that we're going to free up on our EDW platform. Let's reuse it. So let's go out to the business and say, right, I've got this amount of extra space to actually use for you for business processes, which is great. You know, we have to upgrade less often and we can slow the growth profile of that if we want to. We don't have to as well, but we can. And we have a secondary choice. It's like, I suppose, we own data storage for the business for analytics, and we can make the case to say, all right, here's a secondary priced product that's available for you now, whereas before I had one, so which I think is very useful. One thing I did do, so obviously from a kind of technical point of view or a geek point of view or just an extra value point of view, I think everybody else around the business that will be thinking of Hadoop as an enabler for other types of projects, so things like streaming or I suppose moving ETL or things like that later on down the path, is let's not forget about that. Let's make sure that the actual architecture is scalable. I think that's quite easy to do with Hadoop in terms of actually the actual software. It's made that way that you can just expand it, and I'm quite interested with what I heard today about the acquisition by Hortonworks for the actual platform where you can deploy in different architectures with different use cases. That's very exciting for me. But don't forget that, build that into your case. So build your architecture to deal with the current use case that you've got, and actually then make sure it can scale to other ones in the future without having to actually pay the same sort of money again. You can just add the modules that you want and off you go, or beef up your architecture to deal with that extra capacity that you need. Make sure you work with your technical architecture department. They can stop you doing things. That's very important. Make sure it's part of your enterprise architecture. Again, I get very jealous of small companies where that's probably one guy. Brilliant. Big companies, a bit different. And like I say, so you know, that fourth point for me in terms of delivering new processes within IT and BI to actually cope with the new architecture you're putting in, if you're not changing 90% of them, your project is 90% less big, which is very useful. So like I say, in terms of the payback for the project, so I'll be delivering a lot of storage. Actually, in terms of, I'm not going to tell you the exact amounts, but in terms of the storage I justified the case with, is probably around 25% of the storage I'm actually going to deliver. So I'm going to end up with 75% free space to actually use for new projects. So therefore, the value of my archiving case will go up and up and up as the business actually do more projects. So again, that's something you can. It's not that difficult to go and buy hardware that's going to have spare space. So you might as well go and do that in this case if you can justify it. Sorry. So, like I say, keep it simple as well. So, in terms of, I think the technical side of Hadoop is complicated enough. So, from a business point of view, what you really want to be doing is actually make sure that you reuse as much as possible. So, we'll be hooking in the platform to our corporate authentication system for logon. So, I think in the past, with older versions of Hadoop, without things like Ranger and Kerberos integration, that you may have a separate logon when you log on to your Hadoop cluster relative to your enterprise logon for other things. We're not going to do that. I think that will make it fully scalable to integrate with our front-end tools as well. We're going to link into our existing BI tools, and we're going to add Hue as an extra tool if people want to use it. We're going to be using HiveQL, where previously we'd use ANSI SQL and a lot of our other platforms. We're going to use a fault system that we already use for everything else, for you to register a fault as a user. And we're going to... The beauty of an actual archiving project as well is that you don't need to create any new data structures or data definitions. It's exactly the same as what you've already got in your existing data sources. So you don't need to have any problems where you say, I'm creating partition data last couple of months in my RDBMS and then historical data for 10 years in Hadoop. Oh, but the table structure is different, therefore it's difficult to integrate. You don't have to do that. You can just reuse the same structures. So I'm going to hand over now to Jay to talk you through the technical implementation.
Hi guys, I'm going to talk to you about the technical implementation. Before I get into the technical implementation, I'm going to talk about BA's approach when it comes to modeling, because it's quite important, because conformance is extremely important between the platforms as well as we use data across them going forward. So the understanding of data across both platforms and the conformance of column names, for example, is quite important, and column definitions, right, it's quite important to us. So BA across the board uses MDA, model-driven architecture, so everything is around the model, the central model, and all the business is modeled around that, basically. All our services are built around that, and all of our core EDW structures are built around that, and that nicely leads us into any structures that go into Hadoop will be built around that as well. Okay, what that means is automatically you inherit the data dictionary that's already deployed across the enterprise that everyone's familiar with, and everyone will be able to use that. So one of the challenges with Hadoop is, you're deploying all this data into the environment. How do you ensure that the interpretation of that data is the same as what you've got in your source systems? That's actually a mechanism for us to do it. Okay. Where'd it go? So there are some challenges from an architecture perspective within the BA landscape. From an architecture perspective, we still have multiple, from a security perspective, we still have multiple identity providers. What we identified was that there was one core identity provider that we would be using for the Hadoop infrastructure, which brings together all the community that uses the data for exploitation. Because a platform, its definition within the environment is to exploit data. Okay. From a security perspective as well, all data access is controlled through roles on the database layer, and those need to be propagated into the Hadoop environment as well. So we, as part of the evaluation of looking at the different distributions, we looked at a number of distributions, and we found that there was new capabilities that offered us to enable us to do some of this stuff pretty easily. From an infrastructure perspective, we're quite constrained. We have a policy of virtualization of everything, or cloud. That's the policy. And we have a concept of infrastructure patterns we have to follow all the way through. So you define an infrastructure pattern, the infrastructure pattern becomes an automated piece of configuration. You can provision as many nodes as you want on that infrastructure pattern using Puppet, and that's the way and the provisioning is automatic. You just say the number of nodes that you want. So we've had to work very hard with the infrastructure team to build those configurations, to come up with a standard configuration for each node that we've got within our environment. With that comes what is the workloads we're going to be running on our environment, how much I/O we'd need, how much disk space we'd need, how much CPU we'd need. And again, we have to categorize the workload that the platform's going to be using going forward, and how that workload will evolve going forward, and whether the pattern is fit for purpose or not. So that's all part of the work that has to be done up front before a pattern can be defined. In terms of service delivery, there is a number of service delivery models already in place within BA. It's important that we align and integrate with those and use the existing models. There are lots of application areas, but we found that the only area that was equipped to take on and deploy the Hadoop cluster was the EDW team, because in the EDW team they bring together the DBAs, the administrators of that environment. The support function is specific to the enterprise data warehouse environment, as well as the developers and the design leads. So everyone is concentrated in a single area. However, if you look into other areas like normal database management, all those other functions are segregated throughout the organization. The EDW team was the only team that had all the skills required under one banner, really. With being an organization that uses model-driven architecture, we are quite strong on information security. So we have a lot of information security policies. Those policies are propagated to all our environments, and whatever infrastructure we put in place, including Hadoop, will have to conform to those. This was actually the biggest challenge for us around information policies, because what Alan didn't tell you, that the EDW platform is used by everyone across the group and thereabouts, not only BA. So it's used by a number of people, and sometimes the data structures are shared as well. And actually the way we get around that is subsetting and presenting the user with only data that is relevant to them. So implementation of information security policies is really important to us. And then support, again, the EDW team was the only team that was structured in a way where they had their own support team. Support for other technology components is segregated out into small COEs across the business. These COEs don't like open source software. So there is from a support perspective, there is a no open source policy. And that's always a challenge. So has anyone come up against that within their organization? Anyone? Yeah? Loads of nods? Yeah? Okay. I would say to counter that, in a lot of cases, going for a distribution over the open source Apache version helps a lot, because you are providing support to them, you're providing a mechanism, a safety net for them to go back to. We actually went through an extensive exercise where we reviewed a number of distributions, and we chose one in the end, but we chose to go with a certified Hadoop distribution because of that one reason, to meet the needs of support. Okay. So as you know, implementing Hadoop can be challenging, especially if you look at the number of components that are involved, right? And actually, if you look at it from a support perspective and an ops perspective, ops are very good at supporting a singular unit of functionality and supporting it extremely well. But actually, when you say, I actually want to deploy, or in my Hadoop environment, in my ecosystem, want to deploy all these different components, it becomes a very, very different conversation, because they start saying, well, we don't have the skill to support that. And that was pretty common. They don't have the skill to support that. Okay. But again, if you have a team that's equipped to manage that, you can get around that. And also, you need a plan to skill up the support team, the ops team. You need a way of doing that. So there's two ways of doing that. There's either you restrict the types of capabilities that you deploy, right, or for Hadoop, and you allow people to skill up, and over time you deploy more and more capabilities onto the platform, and over time they build up knowledge to support that. Or you employ or outsource the support, okay, which becomes more expensive. And then the case that Alan's talking about, doesn't become relevant anymore, because it's actually more expensive. Even though the software costs are quite cheap, the hardware costs are quite cheap, the ops cost is extremely high. So actually, for an organization like British Airways, who are very conscious of the total cost of ownership and very cost sensitive, they will just reject that as an option to them. Okay. So we reviewed a number of certified Hadoop distributions and chose the Hortonworks platform. We have a number of existing data platforms. One, we found challenges with some of the messages coming out of some of the other vendors, which didn't help us at all. Some of the people in our enterprise architecture team found them to be competing with the existing capabilities that we had, which didn't really go down very well. But we found Hortonworks to be the most open, the most collaborative, and also the ability. And their first position was that we're not coming in to replace anything, we're coming in to complement what we're doing. And what we're doing is adding a complementary capability to our existing EDW infrastructure. Okay. It doesn't take a rocket science to go on Google and search what people are saying about different distributions and what people are saying about different organizations and their positioning around it. And if you imagine a procurement person doing that, or someone in our architecture team, enterprise architecture team doing that, we would just get asked more and more questions about why we would want to go down this route and what value it would create and what complexity it would create, what political issues it would create for us as well. So that's why we chose the most non-confrontational approach. Okay. The implementation principles are quite simple. As Alan spoke about earlier, we will reuse and not reinventing anything that we've created already. So all the EDW functions, capabilities, processes, the existing governance team, the admin team, and the support team will be reused, and they're already getting trained up for that. Provisioning of the environment will be still via our corporate directory environment, where our corporate directory, all our application requests are via corporate directory as well, so it will be done through the same way. And our naming standards and data and information definitions will have conformance, because we will be adopting this similar sort of model. We're not going to really be changing the data structure unless we really have to. Okay. The master of the data stores, what we're not saying is the Hadoop environment will become the master of the data structure going forward. We will still say the source systems are the masters of those data structures going forward. Okay. One of the reasons for that is because we are taking a copy of it and we don't have any control over the source record, we can't be the master of that record. We are someone who takes a copy of it and uses it for exploitation. So as a result of that, we will be able to reuse and leverage the existing information, data definitions, and information definitions across the business. The archiving process will be in line with the current processes, which will be managed and controlled by the EDW team. So we have some current existing processes already for archiving, which write things into other databases. We will use the same sort of processes going forward. That also includes the scheduler and the kite process. So currently what we have is when the process runs, we automatically, if the process fails, it raises a support ticket. We've actually got that process already working as well going forward. So we'll have that as well. We will be adopting that. As Alan spoke about earlier on, the other use cases that we have around the business, because we're putting this platform in to enable the archiving use case, we will be able to do exploratory work and align with overall BA/EA vision to do more stuff on Hadoop and leverage data as a service going forward more extensively. And finally, we will do capability governance. As I spoke about earlier, Hadoop, everyone talks about Hadoop. Hadoop is actually a project. There's loads of other sub-projects underneath it, loads of capabilities. In order to manage the deployment to the operations environment, we will architecture will govern the capabilities that are deployed on the environment, giving the ability for the guys to skill up on the capabilities, support it, and then as new use cases come in, evaluate whether we're going to be deploying those new capabilities or not. Yeah. So we'll talk about how we do that in the next slide, hopefully. So in terms of capability governance, there's 4 areas that we look at. We look at the capability context, we look at the usage policy, the operating model for the capability, and the operational support model. So, and then the Hadoop component that we're deploying is in the middle, right? So, from a capability context perspective, we define the architecture building block. What that means is we are defining what its fundamental functionality is, right, as a building block for us. We will define the solution building block, which is the technical capability. In this case, it's Scoop for pulling data from relational databases, right? Okay. And then the rationale of why we're going to deploy that capability, as well as the architectural limitations. So why do the architectural limitations have such a big bearing on it? Because in the context of Scoop, you will be, if you've got a big data warehousing environment, you wouldn't want to run a big Scoop job that takes over all the data warehouse appliance and pulls all the data across, and actually everyone else who's querying the appliance at the same time doesn't have any resource available to them to do anything. So there will be limitations. From a usage policy, we will have when to use, where to use. And from an operating policy, we will be talking about the types of data that we will be pulling data from, and also the processing pattern. So what we've come up with is a generic processing pattern, so a generic framework that will generate the scripts going forward, which will make stuff easier for us from a deployment perspective. So every script will follow the same pattern. And the orchestration will be done through our common orchestration tool at the moment that is integrated with our support management system. And then monitoring, how it will be monitored, will be defined, as well as incident management and resolution management. All these things have to be defined for each capability to enable us to adopt the technology. At the end of the day, we're not doing this as a point solution. It's an enterprise-wide solution that we're deploying. So as we talked about earlier on, we had a set of challenges from different areas within the organization, and what this slide is presenting of how those challenges were addressed. So from a security perspective, we'll be using Kerberos to integrate with the BA LDAP, which is the identity provider in this case. From an infrastructure perspective, we were using the Puppet environment, the Puppet capability to provision new nodes when we need them. We will also be using Ambari to set up the clusters as part of the provisioning process as well. And we will use Yarn setting up quotas and queues and resource limitations for different applications. From an information security perspective, we found that Ranger met a lot of our requirements in terms of implementing information security policies on the data, especially that's going to be used through HiveQL, as well as HBase, as well as HDFS directly. And from a support perspective, the scheduler will be using Uzi, but we also be using the Control-M scheduler, which is our own Control-M scheduler that we use existing. From a service delivery perspective, BMC, our existing tools will be used and integrated, as well as Ambari, and will be used, and Zookeeper will be used for monitoring the environment going forward. What this will enable us to do is establish our core capabilities within the organization. So as we scale up the number of peripheral capabilities, i.e. capabilities that you can actually do stuff with, we have these capabilities tightly integrated into our existing architecture components, which enables us to roll this out more widely across the enterprise. Okay, so I'll come on to that in the next slide. So this is basically our platform and the capabilities that we'll be rolling out. We see the core capabilities as enablement capabilities, right? These are enablement in terms of without these capabilities integrated into our existing BA architecture, we're not going to be able to roll out any of the Hadoop infrastructure. And then on top, you can see all the acquisition components we'll be using, the data processing components we'll be using, as well as the persistent store and the exploitation capabilities we'll be using to exploit the data. Okay. So all the stuff in grey are stuff that we are looking at deploying as new capabilities going forward. All the stuff that's not in grey are stuff that's going to be deployed as part of this use case. Okay? Any questions?
Did you end up with virtualized hardware?
We ended up with virtualized hardware, but we had to put in place a roadmap for physicalizing them going forward. So from going to virtual to physical, and also we had to put a roadmap for cloud instances as well. What we found actually is there is a parallelly running project that wants to do event-driven data and in the cloud, right? So we had to put that in place, but because the workload of the archiving platform is it's a monthly run, and it's infrequently accessed. It's not accessed very frequently. It was deemed that virtual infrastructure was fine for now. However, what we do have is dedicated physical infrastructure under the grounds, under the virtual machines that is ours, that we've already bought. We're just virtualizing the physical infrastructure that we bought for now. Okay.
In the previous slide, I've seen that you are using both Control-M and Uzi.
Yes.
How do you define which goes to Uzi and which goes to Control-M?
Yeah, so all our Falcon jobs, which will be used for replicating data to our DR environment, will be using Uzi, right? And all the jobs that will be running our archiving process will be using Control-M at this moment in time. That's how we've defined it. Okay.
You're right, you were saying that maybe I misunderstood you, that you're also getting data from other partners, is that correct?
Not at this moment in time, no.
Is that foreseen?
It is...
I'd say
Go on.
some of the data archived is from partners. So some of the data archived is from partners. So it's a group hub for us, but we're not actually landing any data into Hadoop. We're actually just archiving it off. So when we take it in, we're only taking it into EDW, and then we'll take it from the EDW into the archive.
So you have sufficient network structure that data can...
Yes.
That's already in place.
Yeah. So we've got a 10 gig network that we've got in place at the moment, and all the nodes will be on the 10 gig network as well.
We do not have interconnected Hadoop clusters to other physically...
Within the Hadoop cluster itself, they have their own interconnect. But outside of that, connecting to the EDW environment, we have a 10 gig connection at this moment. Okay.
Excuse me? So just one comment. I didn't know you were going to present and mention Control-M, and I'm Control-M product manager, and we have a booth here. So that's funny. But just be aware, and obviously we'll take it as a further discussion. Control-M has a plugin for Hadoop, and it supports all the Apache projects, the familiar one, Hive and Scoop and all the rest. So basically, no need for Uzi. There is even a session tomorrow by our marketing, Uzi or Easy. So you're most welcome to join and see that in the booth as well. Yeah. And we'll discuss later on.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. There's two. There's one over there as well.
Are you talking about having that strong sort of defined model? Does that mean effectively you've ruled out use cases that are all around schema on read, or just the general idea that Hadoop is a great place to bring in lots of weird new data that you've never thought of before?
I'll let Alan answer that, but go on.
Yeah, I suppose no is the answer to that. I think this is the initial use case. We're well aware that we may want to do that. I think what we need to, well, one of the things I'm trying to do is, because I work in BI, I can't really do the benefits case for that. So for example, social media data, bringing that in, structuring it, linking it into structured data for predictive modeling, that's something that the actual business teams and the business departments that will gain the value from that will have to make that case. So I think at the beginning what I was saying about who you are and what budgets you own, it's very important to decide which type of case that you want to run. But yeah, to be honest, we're not ruling anything out.
But I can see that challenging existing data governance processes, which sound very strong at the moment.
Yes, yeah, and I think, to be honest, I think, like I said, because we would have dealt with quite a few of the actual technical implementation issues, I think that will, when that project comes along, one of its biggest challenges will be, well, how do you govern unstructured data, which is something we, by picking this case, we don't have to deal with yet, which is, I think, like I say, if you try and bite off all those things at the same time, it's a very complex project.
And what we found actually is harder to justify because, especially from finance, an organisation like ours is cost sensitive. So what they're looking for is return on value very, very quickly, and they want to measure us on it. So they want to say, how are we going to be able to measure you on what you? We can't do that with social data because we don't know what the benefits are of it. But we could use this anchor case, which has benefits, which has something tangible attached to it, and use this to establish the platform. Oh no.
Do we have time? Or? Okay, let's take the last question.
Go on, Rick.
I don't know who. Sorry, I didn't decide.
One question. I realized this is a first use case on Hadoop. I also see processing part. Are you really considering using a hand-coded solution like Pig? Whereas in the BI industry, for years now, we have mature ETL tools available that can help you bring the productivity and not throw you back into the Stone Age.
So we're not. So I think if you see there, we're not using it yet. So we'd have to go through the process of trying to identify whether we had something already that can do that, or whether that new tool is worth it, and the extra complexity it would add would be worth it. So at the moment, because we're not really doing any data processing apart from just landing the data on Hadoop, again, it's something we don't need to worry about. But I think that's the good thing for us is we have the time to assess each component. We'll probably have we'll have a dev test environment where we'll probably chuck all the components on and see how they work. We have to learn what we're doing. And again, we might need some consultancy help as part of that. But, you know, if you try and chuck all this at your customers at the same time, I think they'll struggle. And I think that will be one of your issues. And like I say, the more users you have, the more complex and the more difficult that becomes.
Great question, Rick, from Informatica. I think there's one more. Can I just? He's had his hand up for a long time. Just one more.
You answered it before. Do you have different stages, like a development stage, test stage, or do you have only one productive cluster where when you change one part?
No, we have. We're going to have 3 clusters.
You're gonna have.
Yeah, we're going to have a dev test.
Okay.
And our test environment will be a DR environment for us as well, and we're going to have a production cluster.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was all right, yeah?